So recently I began reading the first Dune book, and I found this very interesting. They call the first law of mentat. And I won't explain what that word means because for now it's not relevant, but it is. Quoting: a process cannot be understood by stopping it. Understanding must move with the flow of the process, must join it and flow with it. Now, I found this so interesting because so often I feel like there's this tendency when you begin learning something new, whether that's a sport or painting or you start at a new job, whatever it may be, there's a tendency naturally to be overwhelmed at the beginning because there's so much you don't know, especially if you really are a beginner, so much you don't know. So, a lot of times you don't even understand the words that give context what you're trying to learn. As you do it, nothing makes sense. And it's very natural for us to be like, oh, I'm not understanding anything. Let me stop, intellectually learn this first, and then after, I'll probably have a better grasp of it. And while this may be true, I would say here for things that are purely intellectual, so if we're talking about mathematics or programming or whatever it may be, that yes, the actually doing of it requires you understanding very well the intellectual side of it because it's deeply tied. While the same can be said, the more practical something is, the more we start to go into the realm of the just doing things. If you're like, I don't know, if you're learning how to do something with woodcraft, I don't know if that's how you call it, like a carpenter. Well, you can read all the books you want, you can do all of that, but no amount of information is going to tell you the feeling of you sawing through wood or the amount of pressure you need to apply. It simply won't be there. And so, in this attempt to reduce frustration and to essentially slow the process down so much to a point that we stop believing that this is going to give us an edge to understanding, we actually exit the learning process. We exit, as it says here, the flow of things, the natural rhythm of whatever activity it is that we're trying to do. Now, this is not to say, of course, that we must begin right away at the speed that we're going to be doing when we're proficient. Of course not. No one can be expected. Let's say if you're learning a sport, let's say if you're learning how to play football, soccer for Americans, you can expect to dribble as fast as Messi as you begin or as Neymar or whatever. It's not going to happen. But you can dribble. You're not going to learn how to dribble better the ball, better control of the ball by watching videos on YouTube. It simply won't happen because you do not even have the context for what the people are talking about. You don't know the feeling of the ball against your feet. You don't know how it feels to receive a pass, to pass the ball, to the fine touches. You just don't understand because you do not have that feeling. And in that manner, we have to slow the process down. I agree with that, but never to the point that it stops moving. We never must fall into the trap of essentially fully stopping the process. Because if we do that, well, then we're not learning anymore. Maybe in the future we can. And when we have that grasp of things and we understand a bit better, then we can go and intellectualize a bit more. And then we can go and get into these theories and whatnot because we understand what they're referring to. But before we know, and even when we do know, there's always the risk that you get so much into theory that you're way too far out there when you should. You're overcomplicating things way too much. Because when we look at it, in this learning process, this learning phase that really one never really leaves the learning phase, but the initial learning phase, it is so much more, as I see it, about slowing things down to a point that you can somewhat do them as you learn. Now, we can never expect, and I think it's where the mistake is, that we sometimes expect that we can reduce it and slow it down to a point that we won't be frustrated, or that it won't be difficult, or that we won't be at a point that it feels like everything we're doing is wrong. That I don't think it can happen. Unless you do have some big talent, or as some people have like this bigger talent for sports and whatnot, that they kind of pick up things faster, you're just gonna have to be there and deal with that. It is part of the process. It is necessary. You can call it barrier to entry, whatever other terms that serve here to call this stage. It is just necessary. When we're learning how to walk when we're babies, you can't expect, and the camera just died, so I'll put something here perhaps, but you can't expect to just, learn to walk by your parents telling you how to do it. That would be ridiculous. No parent ever thinks about it. They just think, you gotta try, and you're gonna fall, get up, fall, get up, fall, get up, and then one day the things start to click with your body, with your brain, and then you start giving some clumsy steps, and there you go, your first steps. The same can be said, I would say, here for many of the things that we do, whether that's the first literal steps we take, as it is the first steps in learning a sport, or learning how to paint, or learning how to speak a new language, or learning how to whatever, insert here whatever you're learning. But we must, and I think this is where the problem with nowadays, with having so much information, that really becomes a critical problem. Because with all this information, it almost seems stupid not to go and research how to do it. It's even before we begin doing it, we're like, yeah, but let me go research, right? I mean, why waste my time if someone's already figured it out for me? Let me just go. But it doesn't work like that, because no intellectual learning can take place for practical things if we do not have a feeling for them, if we don't understand them. No great teacher of anything would have as the first lesson yapping to you about the techniques and whatnot, because they would know that you don't even have a context for the techniques. If you're learning how to paint, the best first lesson is to be like, here's the brush, here's the paint, dip them, and just see how it feels against the canvas, and then see how it feels putting a bit more water and less water, and when you stack the colors on top of each other, get a feel for it. Something for me that I can talk deeply about, because I spent so many hours on it, is skateboarding. And skateboarding is funny because when I started, now there's more, but when I started, which was, YouTube already existed, some tutorials already existed, but it was nothing that deep. A lot of the tutorials were like, oh, you want to do a kickflip, just pop the board and then flick your foot. And you're like, man, I'm doing that already. So there was not that, that intellectualization of the sport. And so what you had to do is you just grab your board, you go outside to the skate park, and you just try to figure it out your own way. And you fall a lot along the way, and you do these things. But because you're so much in the act of doing, you become much, much more comfortable with the board, with how it feels. And a lot of times, perhaps, yeah, it took much more effort than it should, but you develop such an instinctual feel for things, for what you're trying to do, for how you're doing them wrong, how you got to correct them. And again, when YouTube started to be more prevalent for teachers and whatnot, then all that advice made so much more sense for everyone that was skateboarding, I feel. At least for me, because you have thousands, hundreds of hours already doing it. So then you could apply this. Then when the guy said, oh, you got to feel as if your weight's going there and your shoulders, whatever, then you could practically go and do that, because you weren't thinking about all the other steps that you already had become comfortable with. And that when it talks about here that you have to enter the flow of the process, you really do. And the flow of the process, whatever that process, in the beginning is very similar to all, which is you just got to do it, and you got to be frustrated, and you got to, in a lot of ways, forget about even whatever level of proficiency you're after. And you got to have fun just doing whatever shit you're doing. Like a baby's, like, I don't know, putting not footprints, like fingerprints on paint and just like painting on the walls, doing random shit. That's how you gotta be. Because once you enter that flow and you get a feel for things and you understand them better, and again, I say this as someone that gets very frustrated with things he's learning, and a lot of times watches too many YouTube videos about it and reads too many books about it. But every time I do that, it always goes worse. And every time I step away from that and I just go more back to the basics and just being in the process, the better it becomes. Because going back to what I was saying, if we can be comfortable in that initial stage and just, learning, getting a feeling for it, and then we slowly start to introduce the concepts and the intellectualization of it and the tips and the tricks sparsely here. And if we do that, we're going to find ourselves, after we get past this initial frustration, cruising so much better. Especially, I don't like to do it, but just for the sake of example here, when you compare yourself to other people that were just super on the intellectual side and just really, oh no, but I read all the theory first and then now I'm going to start applying, you're going to be miles ahead, because you're actually going to be having, or you're going to have been doing, I think if that's the grammatically correct way, excuse me here, you will have been doing the thing already. And so, because you will have been doing the thing already, I hope, especially in the real context of it, you will understand it much better. And then you'll be much more ready to actually if you wish to dive deeper into that process, to introduce positively now all the concepts, all the theory, all what the masters have learned and taught, and all of that, because you have a ground to work from. And if you don't have that ground, well, as if you try to build on shaky ground, everything will eventually collapse.